Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Donna Martinez. Welcome to the John Locke Foundation. We are coming to you live from Midtown Raleigh. Thanks for everyone for being here today. Really appreciate that. So how well can the North Carolina economy respond to a shock like the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, we've got a new assessment. It's been co-authored by one of our guests here today, Western Carolina University professor Ed Lopez. In the study, and here today, he's going to be reviewing for us the state's fiscal health, also our economic health, and all of this with an eye towards coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic and having long-term sustainable prosperity in North Carolina. We're joined today by several panelists who have a vested interest, as we all do, of course, in what happens in North Carolina. They are very much involved in decision-making and also the impact of North Carolina economics. Representative Dean Arp is with us today. He serves in the North Carolina House of Representatives. Brian Balfour is my colleague here at the Locke Foundation. He is Senior Vice President of Research. Andy Ellen is our good friend. He is the President and General Counsel of the North Carolina Retail Merchants Association, and the co-author of the study that I've mentioned here today, Professor Ed Lopez, Professor of Economics. He is at Western Carolina University. So gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Appreciate you all being here. I'd like to start today with Representative Arp. If you could give us a sense, just a kind of a quick summary of where we stand here in North Carolina in terms of COVID-19 and the future and how we've come into the pandemic and how we can get out.
Absolutely, Donna. Thank you for having me with these distinguished gentlemen here. We really appreciate that. And first of all, I'd like to start off by kind of giving you a summary of kind of what has happened, what's transpired. You know, we're heading into a full year. We're about to turn the full year on all the shutdowns and the economy and the full-on effect of the COVID response. Immediately, the federal government released what I call roughly the first COVID relief, and it was in the form of a large block grant, generally to the states. And we spent early last year appropriating that. It was a large amount of money and several $billions. And what we did was we took that and we broke it down into various areas that we could, consistent with federal law. And we have been this last year spending that money. And that money is about all spent up until this time, consistent with the federal direction to spend it by the end of last year, basically. But they've given us a little bit of extension of time. Then fast forward to around December, where Congress passed an additional $900 billion stimulus, and we have now are in the process of appropriating that. A significant amount for education, transportation, and things of that nature. And what we've done is broken that down into two parts. The first part dealt with education and was the largest part of that. And then housing and rental assistance, as well as vaccination relief and so forth. And that constitutes almost $2.25 billion in that piece that we've ushered out already. $1.6 billion going to the schools. Another over $500 million going to rent relief. And that is the first part of this second large COVID package. We're in the process now, and I think you should see this week, we're actually introducing a bill on Monday that will deal with the second half of North Carolina's appropriations there for the second round. I fully expect that Congress will issue a third round of what we call aid to the states. That's the $1.9 trillion that they're talking about. What mechanism that has and when it will actually come to fruition, we don't know. But that's
the one that has been passed by the U.S. House, now is over with the U.S. Senate.
That's correct. And that mainly deals with aid to the states. These other ones dealt directly with COVID affected, agencies like the schools and and small business relief and things of that nature. This one will deal with revenue shortfalls to the state and so forth. And so those are the three kind of tranches, if you will, of aid and where we are on that.
Okay, thank you for that update. We're going to talk more about that a little bit later in the hour here. Let's go to Andy Allen. Andy, you represent retailers in North Carolina, and I'll tell you what, I mean, the impact, the devastation that some business owners, managers, and employees have faced over this past year has been really heartbreaking in many cases. Give us a sense of what you're hearing from your members, Andy.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Don. And I echo what Representative Arp said. To be with such a distinguished group of folks is really an honor. It's been really a tale of two cities over the last year, but really a tale of two retailers. The retailers that stayed open the entire time were allowed to grocery store, hardware stores, pharmacies, and some of the others versus those that were initially shut down and how they had to navigate that part of it. You saw one bucket do really well, and people, those were deemed essential type goods, and others that struggled to stay open and stay afloat, but have really had to figure out a way to be innovative and sell their way out of it. And the retail industry fast forwarded about 10 years in about a 12-month period of time, and they went to curbside delivery and delivery of goods. An independent bookstore in my town started delivering books to people's houses, which they had never done before, and they did Facebook Live shows on Sunday nights and Wednesdays, and showed you, Women's Boutique showed you different items that you could buy and pick up or have delivered. So you really had to be innovative in order to do that, in order to really get through this, or sell different items and that you may not have normally carried in inventory. Fast forward to where we are now, I will say we're starting to have some optimism. Next Wednesday, the 10th, we are slated for the grocery stores and the pharmacies and a few of the other retailers to become eligible for the vaccination, our frontline workers. And I think that's going to be a real shot in the arm, so to speak. Confidence wise, we still have a lot of retailers that are hurting. I mean, I talked to a fine men's clothing store, and he said, no one has anywhere to wear anything. You're not going to a prom, you're not going to the country club, you're not going out to eat, you're not going to weddings and funerals, those sort of things. And so people aren't buying some of those items. Some retailers are coming back stronger than others. Others are trying just again to get to the other side. Hopefully some of the stimulus money that Representative Arp referenced will also be of help. Retail had some strong performances. You look at our sales tax last year was up 8%. And that was mainly due to the Wayfair case in the U.S. Supreme Court and what the legislature did to make sure that those online sales got collected along with the brick and mortar sales. And that probably helped save our budget in some ways, and is helpful for that $4 billion surplus that we have. But I really want to say too, we're really proud of the retailers, because if you think about like when the legislature, Representative Arp, and then pass a bill, you usually get 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 6 months to come in compliance. What we saw during the pandemic was every week we would have a new executive order and 48 hours notice, and then multiple local orders from every county and city with something different. And these retailers and other businesses, pivoted on a dime, and within 48 hours notice, we're up and running and putting those requirements in place to provide a safe shopping experience for their customers and their employees. And so they deserve a lot of credit for doing that, because that's what kept people employed. That's what kept tax revenue coming in. And that's what kept the economy in some ways going. So, really proud of them for that. Right now, our big struggle is finding labor. A number of our retailers are having a hard time hiring people. They have jobs available and they're ready to hire to try and push, the economy forward, and as we sort of exit, hopefully, the pandemic in the next few months. But that's our biggest challenge at the moment.
People have been tested in so many ways that many of us never thought we would have to try to deal with in our lifetimes. And I do have to say, Andy, I love the fact that you're talking about all of that innovation. And maybe at some point I can get the information on the boutique that you mentioned that's doing some online things. I think that's awesome. I would love to know more about that. And people, you learn that when you really are tested, you have to come away with more innovations and more new ideas to meet the challenge. And so people have been doing some incredible work just to try to stay afloat and make it through all of this. And speaking of making it through all of this, Professor Ed Lopez over at Western Carolina University, our guest today, has co-authored a study that really takes a look at where we were when we came into this here in North Carolina in terms of fiscal health, economic health, and what it's going to take to move forward. Professor, we really would appreciate you being with us today. Give us a sense of what you found in your study.
Thank you, Donna. It's good to be here with the panel as well as with the audience. I really appreciate Representative Arps teeing it up with the perspective of resources coming through. That's very heartening for many, many families across the state to know that that is in the works because relief is needed. I'll get to a little bit of that momentarily. Also, thanks to Andy Ellen, we've not met before, but it's really good to hear from your perspective as well. Your point about innovation and some of the adaptations I'll try to loop back to. And then also I want to thank Brian Balfour because we leaned heavily on your analysis of the budget situation in the study that we wrote. So thank you very much for being here. What I'd like to do is maybe share my PowerPoint slides now. And without much delay, just kind of get to what I'm going to hope is the point, the main message. And the main message is from the perspective of a professor of economics. Some of the challenges that face the state make sense when you look at them through this perspective, and I'm hoping to offer that. When you use that perspective to analyze the situation, North Carolina, it turns out, came into the period of time when the COVID-19 shock happened in relatively good condition. And that was the result of about a decade's worth of change, which I'm gonna talk about. Looking ahead, policymakers can promote growth and prosperity by maintaining what we found in this analysis, which is a good condition of fiscal health combined with a good condition of economic health. So moving on, I just wanted to point out that our state leaders have prioritized growth and prosperity in their public announcements. That's true at the gubernatorial level, where Governor Cooper says he wants to bring opportunity and prosperity to all Carolinians with more businesses, creating more jobs, and improving the quality of life. Moving on to the recent and newly appointed secretaries of commerce, saying things on the same exact theme of wanting to have sustainable economic growth and creating promising conditions for recovery and growth and prosperity, as well as both major parties' leadership emphasizing the importance of growth and prosperity to bring more purpose to people's lives and more abundance. And I would just say again that this is these are many of the themes that come before the profession of economics when we do our analysis of what's happening in the world. And so I would like to continuing sort of add that perspective. What I think is useful to that perspective is because it helps us to sort of situate the state's efforts in this regard. In the pursuit of prosperity and growth, the state pursues a portfolio of policies, not just what you see on the screen here, but also how industries and occupations, how product markets are regulated, the rules under which buyers and sellers can interact in those settings. In addition, you have these overt programs that are directed specifically at economic development and growth, things like community and rural grants, small town revival initiatives, affordable housing programs, infrastructure investments, and many more. And I think that what is useful is the ability to sort of think about these as first top-down approaches that are very important for many purposes. However, economics understands economic growth to be driven by not top-down forces, but instead bottom-up forces. These top-down policies can serve important objectives and they can serve important functions of um, ameliorating regional disparities in growth, for example. And that's important in the western counties of the state, where Western Carolina University is. And these can ameliorate social and economic disparities as well through assistance to low to high economic insecurity families. However, in pursuit of the state's objectives of growth and prosperity, we have to look to different forces. And that's what we look to in our study. North Carolina's prospects for COVID-19 economic recovery, top-down and bottom-up assessments. And so using this framing of top-down and bottom-up, we want to emphasize all of those oftentimes overlooked. They're sort of everyday, but they're essential components of the process by which a society experiences economic growth towards more prosperity. And so to get started, one thing we do is we say this top down and this bottom up is going to be in response to things that happen to the economy over time. So there's a lot on this screen if you're following along, but if you want to just think about starting on the left as you're viewing the screen and moving towards the right as being, how an economy performs over time, you would select a point in time, say March 2020, and you would say, how healthy is our economy? What are the economic conditions for growth and prosperity in the economy right now? And also, how capable is the government? Because at this point in time, we're about to experience, what's in the middle of this diagram. We're about to experience a shock to the system in the form of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what's in the middle of this diagram is sort of many of the ingredients that come together that economics understands as being how capable is a society, how capable is an economy to responding and getting back on track after a shock like this. And then in response to that, what does our future look like? Do we have more of that growth and prosperity? Do we have many of the things that are provided by growth and prosperity, such as security and equity and justice and more flourishing? Or are we going to not be able to respond to the shock very well and lead to less of those good things and instead experience stagnation and possibly decline? And this is the framework that we put the situation into. It's very big picture and it's very long term. One way to visualize it is that we're moving from the left to the right in this diagram here as time goes by. And the economic health and the fiscal health that a society has is going to be on the table when we experiencing these shocks. Many of these shocks are sort of small and unnoticeable, or we are set up to address them and adapt to them very quickly, so that when, say, an ice storm comes along, we have the capacity as a state, we have the network of resources to deploy to the areas where the people are going to be affected by that ice storm. We can declare an emergency very quickly to allow traffic on the roads, for example, that otherwise wouldn't be needed in the absent the emergency situation. We are set up for things like that. And because we're set up for them, we kind of go through those periods without much trouble to anyone. But sometimes there are the big shocks, the ones we haven't seen before, the ones we're not set up for. But we're set up for things that help us to adapt to those shocks. This is kind of the idea that we get to with the top-down capacity to respond. As we move forward, we're going to see that that's really necessary, because this shock has had, it has taken its toll on the state, and we can see that through the data of the labor market, where rolling forward from January 2015 on this slide, we see that the pattern was for job growth in the economy, in the North Carolina economy, to exceeding 4.9 million jobs prior to the pandemic, and bouncing back, but not recovering fully, still some 250,000 or so by the latest numbers, short of the employment levels pre-pandemic. Similar story if you look at the number of unemployed. The number of unemployed shot up in March 2020, has come back down, but has leveled not to the pre-pandemic, but instead about 100,000 additional unemployed. Labor force, number of people who are participating in the labor force, either working or actively looking for work, still about 100,000, if not a little bit more than 100,000 short of pre-pandemic levels. These are folks who would be working if not for the shock that the coronavirus has posed, and our limitations in our ability to respond to it. And similarly for the employment to population rate, because this is so important for thinking about what are the number of jobs in the economy. And for years rolling forward from 2015, we're 58% and above. But even after this bounce back, we're still below 56%. So we have a long way to go still. And it's important that we have this resiliency and we think about how we're recovering from this long-term shock. And so one important ingredient, as Representative Arp was saying, pardon me, one important ingredient, as Representative Arp was alluding to, and that we were able to gather some information from this study by Brian Balfour, as well as a couple of other studies, is that the North Carolina fiscal situation was in relatively favorable shape coming into the period when the coronavirus hit. And we go into some of the information from say 2002 and forward that led to that relatively high cushion, if you will, of available funds coming into the pandemic, higher than 36 other states. What this means is that think about the way I was describing, being set up to address an emergency situation, is we're as a well-functioning state in a modern economy, we do have a government that is networked from the capital through the counties to all areas where Carolinians live. And through that network, we have the ability in principle to direct resources where they're needed. But if those resources are in short supply, or if it's difficult for the state to come by them, then that's going to compromise our high capacity as a state government to respond. If the dollars aren't there, we can't utilize our very sound structure as well as if we have more dollars there. And that's why that was so important coming into the pandemic, because through those channels we can provide the relief and the boost that so many businesses and families were in need of and continue to be in need of. But it's important to continue to maintain that fiscal health as well. Really where this study makes, I think, the more, I wanted to mention that how that decade of progress got North Carolina to the point of ranking in the top 10 in the country in terms of fiscal health. This is, again, coming into the period of the pandemic. This is a study that was released in 2018 by the Mercatus Center, looking at the fiscal conditions up to that point. So, but for the reasons, as I was mentioning on the previous slide, that ability for the state of North Carolina to respond to future shocks, everyone knows that we're going to experience those future shocks, and we might experience a large one. Hopefully not as large as we've experienced in the last year. We all could use a break, but the ability for the North Carolina government to respond to those shocks is in better condition because we rank in this top 10 compared to if we ranked lower. Now, that was sort of wrapping up the top-down part of the assessment summary of it. We also looked at the bottom-up situation, and the way we did that was we did that through an index of economic freedom. The idea here being that those forces that are important to bottom-up growth, they can have impediments put in front of them because they consist of individuals and families looking for ways to better themselves, maybe starting a business, maybe going to school, maybe taking a couple of classes to earn a certificate, look for a new job, maybe move to create a new job, a young couple starting out, trying to advance, trying to think about how to do the best for for themselves and their families. These are the sort of micro level elements of the performance of any economy, including the North Carolina economy. And the idea of economic freedom is to say, where might people have impediments to the steps that they think are good for them in their economic lives? And where might those impediments exist, but they don't seem to serve a whole lot of other purpose? That's going to be part of the theme that our paper goes to. As far as what's measured in economic freedom, though, they look at public policies that do constrain, for good reason or for not, but they do constrain people's economic freedom. And what you can see is that as measured, rolling forward from the from the mid 80s up until the time of the pandemic, North Carolina, which is shown here in the solid line, is above the United States average for the whole period. North Carolina is an above average state when it comes to economic freedom. North Carolina also has experienced some pretty wide swings, especially leading up to and in response to Great Recession, and then sort of climbing out of the era and the period of the Great Recession. What's driving this are some of the decisions that led to the state being in a good fiscal condition, but also some of the regulations surrounding occupations were put up for revision during this period as well. And what's happening here is that this index is reflecting the changes in public policy, some of them maybe not that big or news headline grabbing, but that lead to an environment in the state that better supports and it leads to better conditions for this bottom-up growth to occur. And those changes were picked up by the measurements in this index. And on this basis, we're saying that this improvement for about the last decade puts North Carolina in a situation of relatively good economic health coming into the pandemic. Now, just to sort of look at this from a little bit further perspective, we can add in some neighboring states. And this is the same sort of duration, mid 80s forward to before the pandemic. And what we have here is the same. We have the national average repeated as well. But then we have neighboring states, Tennessee, Virginia, Georgia, and South Carolina. And in terms of one takeaway here is that all the states sort of have this cycle that's up and down around the period of the Great Recession, and all 5 of these states are also increasing their scores on this index since the Great Recession. So North Carolina is similar in that regard. However, North Carolina doesn't. You can see how North Carolina also stacks up here relative to South Carolina, which ranks relatively low for the duration. But especially since Great Recession, there may be some separation there between North Carolina and South Carolina. As you dig into what's driving that, the main thing is that the budget health is the disparity there between North Carolina and South Carolina. Relative to the other states, Georgia, Virginia, Tennessee, however, North Carolina is around the top 10 in the country, but still below these 3 other states in our region, and in terms of the measured economic and measured index of economic freedom. Now, further sort of taking another look at this to break it down a little bit is that the index is the component of 3 areas, one of which measures overall budget health, one of which measures tax competitiveness, and the third of which measures the regulatory environment, especially on labor markets. And what you can see in this chart is that, again, looking at this big cycle from the Great Recession, but then the period since, is there has been some improvement in all 3 areas of North Carolina's economic freedom scenario. There's been improvements in the budget health and the tax competitiveness and in the worker regulation. And again, this is part of the basis on which we say good economic health. So wrapping up, we do have some areas for improvement still. And if there are some areas to look at, they might be summarized on this slide. Some market entry restrictions, for example, what's called certificate of need laws, the way certain insurance markets and consumer markets are regulated. Slight tweaks to these can increase people's economic freedom without compromising public interest on the other hand. And based on this study, we would argue that promotes the conditions for long-term prosperity and growth. You can make a similar type of look at price restrictions in certain markets, occupational restrictions, like many states. North Carolina has been on that long-term trend of licensing increasing numbers of occupations. And I think that based on this study, we would just say, what is can we look for areas to fine tune that so that the public interest is served, whether it's safety or some other public interest, while not unduly or overly restricting people's economic freedom, because we know that that's important to future prosperity and growth. And so those might be some specific areas we could look at. And I think that what I'd like to suggest is that maybe policymakers look at take sort of more a portfolio approach to economic policy. And in that portfolio, look for balance. Balance is healthy for some of the same reasons that the level of health is healthy. We would like to see how maybe in some areas restrictions on economic activity might be required for safety or for some other public purpose. And perhaps when acting on those required situations, when doing those required things, those necessary things, perhaps think about, well, this is restricting economic freedom, even though it's necessary. Perhaps there are other areas in the portfolio of economic policy where we might be able to increase economic freedom without compromising some public interest. If you want to think about the implications of this broad, big picture, long-term study, one of them would be this portfolio approach to economic policies. Thanks for the time. I went a little bit over, but I think there's still plenty for some discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. Really fascinating, and there's so much to dig into there. What I'd like to do is the professor goes ahead, and if you can close out your screen, Professor, that would help us. And we can bring back in our panelists. Again, we have joining us today Representative Dean Arp. He's out of Union County. He is the Senior Chairman of Appropriations. I think I have that title right for you, Representative Arp. Brian Balfour is my colleague here at the Locke Foundation. He is the Senior Vice President of Research, and Andy Ellen is with the North Carolina Retail Merchants Association. He is President and General Counsel there. I will remind you folks that if you are joining us on Facebook, in the comments section, my colleague Brene should be posting there the presentation, the actual report that Professor Lopez has co-authored. That should be linked there. And also an interesting op-ed column that Representative Arp wrote for CarolinaJournal.com just a few days ago about the North Carolina fiscal situation. So you'll be able to access both of those in the comments section of our Facebook page. All right, let's go to Brian. Brian, what's your reaction to what you've seen here from Professor Lopez?
Yeah, thanks, Don. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And Professor Lopez, appreciate the presentation, all the information you presented. I just wanted to, I guess, maybe elaborate a little bit more on some of my research that you referenced and have the viewers get a little more specifics. And one of the things that was brought up in the presentation is that North Carolina was better positioned to handle the financial or the economic downturn, caused by the COVID pandemic and the shutdowns and everything. And I what I did was kind of draw a comparison between where we were at last year, right around this time, from a fiscal standpoint, from state government budget, to the last time we had the Great Recession hit in 2008, 2009. So just a couple of items to keep in mind, just to really draw the contrast and differences of why we were so much better prepared. For example, in the 8 years leading up to 2009, the state general fund budget increased by 49%. Compare that to the 8 years leading up to and including 2020, where the state budget increased by a total of only 16%. So a dramatic difference. And that growth came even during a time when tax revenues grew by 30%. So there was a tremendous amount of fiscal restraint by the state legislators in containing and slowing the growth of state government. And so that really enabled the state to be much better prepared. We had built up a 1.9 billion in savings in the rainy day fund. And that was in 2018 prior to Hurricane Florence hit. So we were even prepared for that as well, still over $1 billion in the rainy day fund. And I think that becomes really important also is that, North Carolina has not had to resort to any sort of tax increases to try to balance the budgets as a result of the economic slowdown from last year's situation. Contrast that to, again, 2009, where North Carolina had to raise, they because of the unsustainable nature of the spending commitments, North Carolina raised all three of its major state taxes, corporate and personal income taxes, along with the state sales tax. And at the time, those taxes cost North Carolinians in excess of $1 billion. So they're just really bad policy to try to impose more taxation on the economy when it's hurting like it was in 2009. So now North Carolina is going to be able to avoid, those kinds of bad policies like increasing taxes while the economy is still struggling. So I just wanted to kind of point out some of those and contrast some of the significant differences and what a major difference it can make when the state legislature is actually embarking on fiscally sound and restrained in terms of budget growth.
That's such an important point, Brian. And Representative Arp, that rainy day fund we saw on Professor Lopez's chart there, that was a big amount of money. And there had been at times some real pushback, some real criticism from people who thought that the state was putting away too much money and that it was not balanced. I'll use that term as Professor Lopez was using it. But it turned out that was a very sound long-term decision made by the legislature.
Well, it is. And Professor Lopez is exactly right in that you have to have this portfolio view. It's like a dashboard where you have to keep watch all different aspects of that, of the economy. And you have to do it all from tax reform. We did the rainy day reform in terms of a savings reserve. We were roundly criticized, even to the point of right before the hurricane hit, we were chastised because we weren't using that money for regular operating expenses. And then a hurricane hit, and we had two in 1 year. And we weathered through that, no pun intended, for our most hurting families. And that's where North Carolina is. And so several key things that we had done, I think structurally changed the way we approach our fiscal health in North Carolina. Was we set up a rainy day fund, and it even just recently we've got the recommendation that it should be 10% of what our previous year's revenue was target was. And so roughly $25 billion budget, 10% of that roughly is $2.5 billion. So you can see we're about $1.3 billion short to take care of those economic disasters, those things. But yet we've had those, and they have certainly mitigated the problems. Another thing that I'm just very excited about is that we had a regular review. We put in place that all the regulatory reform, we review our regulatory policy on a continuing basis. Every time, every 10 years, we have every policy come up and have a regular review and say, is this still needed? Do we need to tweak this? And so it's a constant review of those things. And then coupled with the tax reform and spending reform that we have implemented, have really put North Carolina in a good place to provide the services that our citizens need, even in the time of pandemic. That's what you save for, so that when these things happen, you know they're going to happen, economic cycles, natural disasters, and so forth, that you have enough in there that it smooths out the bumps.
You know, you mentioned the review of regulations. I would put that in the category of what Professor Lopez referred to as the reforms that don't make the headlines, because they're really not sexy. Actually, they do make headlines at Carolina Journal, carolinajournal.com.
Yes, they do.
Because they're important public policy decisions. But some people may not realize the impact and the import of those. Andy, I think that your members do, because in the retail industry, you folks have to pay attention to all that kind of thing and compliance. The more rules you have, and of course, some of them are appropriate and necessary, but the review process is now in place so that you decide, is it still appropriate and necessary, or has it served its purpose and we no longer need it? But whatever it is, it adds to the cost of doing business.
Absolutely. And we had the opportunity, our organization, Elizabeth Robinson, that works with me, to present to the House Regulatory Reform Committee on Thursday of last week, along with Becky Gray from the John Locke Foundation, about the importance of it. And two other things I would point out too, the Rules Review Commission that looks at every rule that's coming through from an agency to make sure that that agency has a statutory authority and that rule is appropriate to be adopted, not policy-wise, but that the agency followed the process and did public hearings appropriately and did public comment, and that it was, again, within the statutory authority, and that the rule is clear and unambiguous so that people understand what it means and what it costs is really an important backstop in that rulemaking and regulatory framework. I also wanted to point out, Representative Arp, one of the things that the General Assembly did really well that we were very fortunate of was, prior to 2013, our unemployment insurance trust fund had about a $2.8 billion deficit, and we were in really bad shape. And due to some really great work by the General Assembly, Representative Julia Howard, Senator Bob Rucho, and others that led that, and Representative Arp is certainly a part of that. We now have a $2.7 billion surplus, down a little bit from $4 billion, almost $4 billion surplus. But we're one of the very few states in the country right now that is not having to borrow money from the federal government for unemployment insurance benefits. This is a time when we need those benefits for unemployed people. But those are tax dollars that are coming from the employer, every paycheck, into that system. And because of their good work, those taxes have not gone up again. And there's actually a bill that would keep it at a base level at 1.9%. But that's really important as businesses are trying to hire back employees, that you don't add another tax on them employing somebody. And so that's something that also often gets unlooked or looked by sometimes, but is really a strong part of our economy and our system right now, in addition to all of the tax reform and fiscal conservatism that Representative Arp talked about.
Andy, I was looking at some of those charts that Professor Lopez had on the screen about labor participation rates, and you can just see the big difference of pre-pandemic to now. Early in our conversation, you mentioned that in your industry, some of your members are actually looking for people right now. So perhaps we're going to see those numbers start to move up a bit. Is it all tied to vaccinations, Andy?
Some of it is, but I have the story of when the pandemic first hit. I had one of my grocery store members who went down the shopping center to the pizza restaurant that was having to close, and said, "I'll hire all your people, and when the pandemic is over, I'll give them back to you, but I want them to have a job," and hired all of them. The second time around, because the unemployment benefits had gotten so high between the state and the federal match, he had a hard time hiring any of them. But retailers right now, if you think about a grocery store, they're having to do extra cleaning. They're having to do extra stocking later during different times. Until last week, they were having to stage somebody in front of every single store if you had more than 15,000 square feet to check for occupancy limits and that sort of thing. And so we were having to have extra labor, but you also have employees that may have been exposed to COVID and had to stay home. So you need those extra employees to keep your business running right now. And so that's very crucial. Although, again, I think the vaccination piece is a crucial part, for people that really truly are concerned about being in a workplace. And again, we want to provide the safest shopping experience for customers and the safest, employment place we can for our employees. And so part of that is making sure you got enough people when they are sick, that they can be out of work.
That's exactly right.
Go ahead.
Andy is exactly right. We saw this coming out of the recession, that it was a very obtuse thing that the longer the UI benefits were extended, the unemployment rate ranked high. That is actually my concern about federal policy coming out right now. We pulled out of the recession and took off on a run in our economy, North Carolina, when we reformed our unemployment insurance. And these numbers that Professor Lopez showed, I believe, will be extended if we're not careful with how we look at that policy. The jobs are out there, as Andy was referring to. It's connecting those there and make sure we don't have a perverse disincentive for people to get back to work.
Professor, I was looking at some of your conclusions, and there was a phrase that you used in your report that really jumped out at me. You referred to clearing paths for ordinary people to move forward with rising prosperity and flourishing for all. And I think sometimes some of us forget that, yes, this is about ideas and it's about policy choices and all that, but when you get right down to it, you're talking about ordinary people who are impacted every single day by the decisions that our elected leaders make. And it does matter, as your study shows. It matters, and it matters whether you're thinking short-term or long-term.
It's true. I think that when we're using economics to look at the top-down aspect of what we're studying both the top-down and the bottom-up. We get into language and we get into terms where it's easy to sort of for the humanity to sort of get lost in the shuffle. We have these big categories called gross domestic product, and we have these large categories called the labor force. And, there's so much variety and diversity in those categories. So that they need to be matched with these bottom-up recognitions as well. So we have we have this sort of tale of two retailers that Andy has brought forward to our attention. I think that it gives us a good way maybe of describing how this bottom-up process of recovery is working. It is true that some jobs that were in high demand are going to not be in high demand as much anymore. Jobs that involve a lot of the close personal contact, but there are a lot of areas where there are new demands created. So, for example, just to pick an easy one, say delivery. But that story unfolds in many, many different ways. And what's happening here is we're seeing a rebalance of labor in the labor market. This labor force is part of the diversity that's in that big category. Is we're seeing a rebalance towards those skills that are now going to be in high demand post-pandemic, and away from those skills that are going to be gone or in no demand or in just lower, permanently lower demand. And so the labor market needs to reshuffle and rebalance. And what we're seeing in this tale of two retailers is part of the process of that. We also need to rebalance a lot of capital. I don't think the movie theater market, for example, is going to return to its pre-pandemic levels. So something has to happen with those facilities. That capital needs to be redirected. That's what we look at from a sort of economic perspective. And the process of redirecting that are individual, firm, and contract level. And so that needs to happen from the bottom up. Now, I think that these adjustments often come along with innovations. And early in the pandemic, we were looking around and asking, who are the businesses, which are the firms that are going under? And a very common theme was those that were not very resilient in the first place coming into the pandemic, those that maybe didn't have great books, those that maybe had maybe a steady share of a dying market. Well, those firms were on the edge anyway, and those were the first to be, sort of resources moved out of those businesses. Well, where are resources moving into? This is the story of bottom-up development and bottom-up recovery. My punchline to all of this, I'm sorry, but I speak in professor durations. I promise.
That's okay. We're listening. We're very attentive.
But there's practical stuff we can look at. So for example, the Center for Study of Free Enterprise has some reports coming out on EMS professionals. And it turns out that, there might be one of these examples of a non-headline getting tweak that could do a lot of good for access to EMS professionals, especially in Western counties where I live. And so there's something called the
EMS, to help us understand, emergency, you're talking about emergency medical?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I jumped into that a little quickly, but I'm talking about EMTs and paramedics and so forth. They're more than ambulance drivers. The pandemic has put them into a situation where they're having to not only be COVID screeners, but also do many more things in the field, things that they're professionally capable of, and that their profession is evolving to make them capable of, to give them the training and the preparation to execute in a way that helps our families in need. However, the regulatory structure could use some catching up. And so there's something called the EMS Professionals Personnel Licensure Interstate Compact. REPLICA is the acronym for that. And North Carolina is not a member to that. But maybe if North Carolina were a member to that, resources would flow from nearby states and into where our people are in need when necessary. It would just make it that much easier for this bottom-up development to grow. And maybe for every one of these examples, there's 5 or so more that we could also look at through that, partially through that process of regulatory review that Representative Arp was mentioning.
Professor, I have a feeling as soon as you said that, Brian Balfour's ears probably perked up, because it gets into the issue of universal licensing recognition and doing away with some of those rules so that people can find a job easier, and so that we could transfer skills much easier to fill the need as it comes up. Brian, what say you about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree completely. It's so key and so critical to try to eliminate and otherwise reduce those barriers, those government barriers that are going to hamper that process that Professor Lopez was talking about, that process of the economy transitioning to what it was before and transitioning to what it's going to be moving forward. And, to try to reallocate those scarce resources, labor and capital and investment and so forth into those lines of production that are in tune with consumer preferences moving forward. I mean, obviously that, one constant with the economy is change. We saw significant changes back in the Great Recession after the real estate bubble popped. We saw there was far too many resources being devoted to the real estate industry. Those resources had to be reallocated and redeployed into sustainable lines of industry that weren't propped up by government policies. So yeah, it's really critical that the professional licensing and other things of the nature, and even taxation. I would argue too that if North Carolina goes back to its kind of high spending, high taxes environment, that's going to discourage entrepreneurs and business investment to staying or relocating or locating, moving to North Carolina. We want to make sure that our state is hospitable to entrepreneurs, to businesses, especially in relative to other states. We want to be much more competitive to attract those investors that are going to create the jobs that so many people still, as the numbers show, still far too many North Carolinians are still out of work. And so we need to continue to draw and make North Carolina an attractive draw for capital investment, and which is going to spur additional job growth.
And Donna, that's where I feel like some of our greatest pressures are going to be, that we abandon the very thing that put us in a good position, and that's controlled spending and the tax policy. I mean, we save to get us over those humps so that we don't have to fundamentally change the good policies that we've got going through. I do think the vaccination are going to be a key part in getting people comfortable going back to work and basically getting over this COVID response. However, I just think our entire economic and business systems have fundamentally changed. We will never go back to the way it was. because of the new innovations and for instance, retail office space. So many people have dealt with working remotely and have made that there. And there's just a fundamental change in rethinking office rent and leases and capital investments. So there's going to be a huge pressure for us to change and spend more. We've had a fantastic bottom line, but that's one-time money. Year over year, we've got a K-shaped recovery. And so we have as much downward pressure for certain segments of our economy that we've got to be careful about. We're not out of the woods yet. We still have to hold to the fundamental principles and provide those resources in a very wise way so that we don't spend our way out of a hole. Yeah.
And to your point, Representative Arp, there is a recommendation that Professor Lopez makes in which he refers to a difficult task, and it can have its own painful choices. And that pressure you're talking about is all part of that. Andy, to the point of being nimble and innovation and resiliency and all that, do you have a sense of whether it's raw numbers or percentages of retailers that just simply have not been able to make it through the past year versus those that have been able to adapt in some way, or maybe even new businesses that have emerged to meet this new type of demand?
Let me say that, we heard a lot through the media back in the spring, and it was the retail apocalypse and how the retail industry was going to die as you know it. And we're predicting 25,000 stores nationwide would close. What I would say to you is at the end of December of last year, there were about 8,800 stores that closed, which was actually less than in 2019. And I believe Professor Lopez mentioned, part of the issue was trying to figure out were they in trouble beforehand. And some of the ones that went out of business, a Stein Mart, a Pier 1 that went in bankruptcy and never came out, were teetering to begin with. So the retailers, though, as I mentioned earlier, that have gone out and been innovative and developed an online social channel or social media channel, omni-channel, so they're online and brick and mortar, and figured out how to touch their customers, remotely. I think they're well positioned as we go forward, as we start to come out of the pandemic to be better off. Back to Representative Arp's piece, I'm in downtown Raleigh, and the building towers near me, Wells Fargo and BB&T, are pretty much empty, but that affects, the people around, the coffee shop, the dry cleaner, the other folks. I've got a bar on either side of our office, and, they've been closed, but, next week, maybe you may see some people out there. But those are the things I think we've got to sort of, as people come back in the office, or figure out how they work remotely part of the time, where all that goes. But the people that sat back are the ones that didn't make it through. The people that really worked, innovated and figured out how to navigate it, they're going to be here to stay, and they're going to be better for it.
Professor, as we close today, I'm going to give you the final word. If you have a key member of the legislature right here in Representative Arp, but if you were to have just a final brief thought for state legislators on what it is that they need to do moving forward, the principles they need to keep in mind in order to make this state grow and come out of this for long-term fiscal stability and prosperity, what are your words of wisdom?
Well, thanks for the opportunity for that. I think that an easy way to describe how I would respond to that is think about innovations plural, not just innovation singular as a category. The reason I want to stress that is because innovation is going to be what spurs future growth and prosperity. There's no two shakes about that. However, the way we think about innovation is important. I think that it does include the big ideas that get sort of perfected and honed in large budget R&D departments. However, and I think that that's what comes to mind when we think about innovation. However, history tells us that our current level of prosperity rests on so many little innovations that have come along the way. So many little innovations, like the light bulb, for example, and many, many more, like in our state, human manned flight, for example. Many of these were the product of not large departments and budgets and sort of central office management of the process, but instead they were the outcome of unsung craftsmen and tinkerers and experimenters, looking all over the earth for just the right compound that would allow the filament to burn at just the right conditions to perfect the idea of the light bulb. The Wright brothers doing all of the things and experiments and looking at natural bird flight and so forth, and taking inspiration from that in ways that other persons attempting manned flight weren't. The Wright brothers came across the right combination, and they did so in an unsung, bottom-up bubble because they had the freedom to take the risk type of way. And so my parting thought would be, give some credit to that. It matters in 2021 as much as it does ever. In the conditions of economic freedom, if we can find ways to increase those conditions, we're going to put ourselves in a better condition to have that future growth and prosperity that everybody says we want.
Really interesting thoughts for sure. Final thoughts from any of our other panelists here?
Donna, we just appreciate the opportunity to talk about this sincere and very important issue on how we steady the teal as we go through these tough times, for sure. Thank you.
And Andy, we wish all of your members the best. Of course, there are friends, our neighbors, our family members who are out there trying to work, trying to sustain. And we hope that with more vaccinations and more innovation, and the people, little people who are thinking and tinkering right now, we're going to make our way out of this so that North Carolina can be the state that even more people want to come and be part of. Andy, thank you so much. Andy Allen is with the North Carolina Retail Merchants Association. Brian Balfour is my colleague here at the John Locke Foundation. By the way, you can read all of Brian's work every day at johnlocke.org. And Representative Dean Arp is representing Union County in the North Carolina House. He is the senior chairman of appropriations. So he's a numbers guy for sure. He knows it inside and out and helping to guide North Carolina to those sound decisions. And Ed Lopez is the professor of economics at Western Carolina University. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate all your thoughts today.
Thank you.
And folks, thank you for joining us as well. This is really interesting stuff as well as important stuff. And we always appreciate that you find it important enough to give us your time. I would ask you for one final thought, and that is this, that if you like what we're doing here at the John Locke Foundation, please consider supporting our work. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We rely on the tax-deductible donations that you make to help fuel our work. If you'd like to make a tax-deductible donation, it can be done very quickly. Just go to johnlocke.org, and in the upper right-hand corner, there is a donate tab. Just click on that. It's secure, it's safe. You can make your donation in less than 2 minutes. We would really appreciate your support. Everyone have a wonderful week. On behalf of the entire John Locke Foundation and Carolina Journal team, I'm Donna Martinez. Have a great week. We'll see you next Monday.